All right, class, this video is going to cover the election of 1912. I've broken it down into four major parts, so let's go ahead and get started. Um, we last left Theodore Roosevelt having launched progressive reform at the national level, and as he decided to step down going into the 1908 election, he actually went on safari in Africa seeking big game. Remember, he was, a big game hunter and a sportsman all around. So after harvesting several select specimens, he toured Europe. But then he started to miss the presidency and discovered himself suffering from the anticlimactic lifestyle of such a young has-been. Still vigorous, he returned to the United States to tremendous fanfare and launched a new crusade and eventually a new third party. The story of his falling out with William Howard Taft is behind this political tantrum. As a nation, careened towards this showdown that was the election of 1812. It was perhaps the most important presidential election in all our history. The Progressive Reform Movement had promised much, but the second decade of the 20th century asked whether the federal government could solve all the problems of an increasingly diverse society. The results of the 1912 election revealed the hope that progressivism was up to the challenge. So we're going to start off with Theodore Roosevelt. So incredibly, TR picked one of the most out-of-the-way places imaginable to launch his crusade to take back the presidency. He delivered a speech in Osawatomie, Kansas, and coined this new phrase for his new progressive program, New Nationalism. He had read Herbert Crowley's The Promise of American Life one day, and he came to believe that the federal government must solve the problems that even states could not solve for themselves. The major economic assertion of New Nationalism was that trusts were not inherently evil or harmful as long as they were subject to the federal regulation of watchdog agencies. When you guys had asked, what was the difference between New Nationalism and New Freedom, that was one of the core differences between Roosevelt and Wilson. And then he said something quite startling for an American ex-president. Roosevelt is quoted as saying, "Every man holds his property subject to the general right of the community to regulate its use to whatever degree the public welfare may require it." If this quote doesn't immediately cause you to shudder, I wonder at which word that follows you will get a cold chill. Consider the implications of your property being your land, your business, your inventions, or your children. In the shadows cast by the glare of TR's popularity, there was another reform governor of New Jersey, and he began to formulate another progressive agenda that he called New Freedom. Formerly a professor of political science and the president of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson was another historian and the intellectual match of Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson's famous book was A History of Politics in America, and he believed that he was the one man who knew what America needed. He said that all trusts were evil, and all trust should be eliminated. Furthermore, he was a Democrat born in the South, and so he embodied American political progress beyond the animosities resulting from the Civil War and Reconstruction. So before we get too much into these two gentlemen, a brief look at the other branches of the federal government is in order before we watch these reform titans clash over the presidency. TR had created bipartisan conservatism in the Congress as the legislative branch tried to balance the power of the most powerful president the country had yet seen. Furthermore, TR had placed a Chief Justice on the Supreme Court that was an advocate of change. The Gilded Age presidents had created a court that was anti-labor, anti-welfare, and pro-business. The court was so conservative that when the idea of an income tax was first raised, they struck it down as unconstitutional. Roosevelt's appointment, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., would join forces with Justice Louis Brandeis, the first Jewish person on the Supreme Court, to one day move the court towards progressivism. These two new justices admonished their fellow judges to leave laissez-faire conservative preferences out of the interpretation of laws passed by the states. They said piously that law is above personal values. They said, go to the Constitution. Statements that belied the fact that they were inserting their personal values in their interpretation of the Constitution, just as their predecessors had. Progressives elected to Congress Oh, sorry. Progressives were elected to Congress and joined with the new justices in bickering with the old guard, the conservative Republicans left over from the days before TR transformed the presidency and launched progressive reform. One other candidate for the presidency in 1912 needs examination, and this was the incumbent, William Howard Taft. The reason that TR had eventually repudiated Taft and ran in 1912 is that his hand-picked successor had dropped his Crusader legacy and more sided with this old guard. Even their personalities and temperaments were in sharp contrast. Whereas Roosevelt made speeches off the back of his presidential train as it left Washington, even if there was only one person there that would hear him. Taft would already be asleep in his reinforced berth before the train began to move. Taft weighed 350 pounds, and throughout his adult life, did not move quickly to reform anything. He lacked Roosevelt's personal appeal and was even more stubborn and more uncompromised than the Roosevelt. Remember, this is a guy, Roosevelt was a guy who always thought he was right, and anyone who disagreed with him was an idiot or an enemy. And Taft was more stubborn than he was. And so one of the key events here for the Taft presidency was a flashback almost to the Gilded Age, where Taft's administration produced scandals. One such was the Ballinger-Pinchot affair. Gifford Pinchot was the chief of the U.S. Forest Service, and he accused the Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger, of neglect. Pinchot said Ballinger allowed unscrupulous coal mining on the 65 million acres of coal reserves that Theodore Roosevelt had set aside. In an investigation, Ballinger was proven innocent, but he was smeared in the progressive press. Then he did the worst thing possible after being exonerated. He resigned in exhaustion at all the criticism. Taft was smeared because he supported Ballinger through the whole affair. Taft didn't help his own image after promising a lower tariff by sitting idly while Nelson Aldrich of the old guard actually increased it. To the amazement of all, Taft pronounced the Payne-Aldrich tariff as the best tariff ever passed. And so the Ballinger-Pinchot affair and the Payne-Aldrich tariff is going to create this division between the old guard of the Republicans that would support William Howard Taft and the new guard that's going to be supporting the more progressive Theodore Roosevelt. So Roosevelt, like I said, he's at the center of this formation of the Progressive Republican League, and the goals of which were either to oust Taft or to start a new party along the lines of New Nationalism. By 1910, Roosevelt was openly challenging Taft, his own protege. But Taft stood pat. Taft stood firm. As the Republican National Convention got underway, Robert Lafayette tried for the nomination, but Roosevelt disliked Lafayette and decided to run again himself. The old guard, however, chose Taft, and Roosevelt and the progressives walked out of the convention, and this was a fatal split of the Republican Party. After this brokered convention, a rather naive journalist asked Theodore Roosevelt if he thought he was fit to run again for the presidency. I'm surprised that Roosevelt didn't deck the young man, but apparently all he did was snap his teeth together and bellow, "I'm as fit as a bull moose." Again, he had coined a political slogan. The third party that Roosevelt was to run with in 1912 became known as the Bull Moose Party. So as Roosevelt starts campaigning, another story that adds to the Roosevelt myth, the Roosevelt lore, happens. One day while standing up in an open car on his way to deliver a campaign speech, Roosevelt was actually shot in the chest by a deranged man who'd been ruined by the liquor laws that Roosevelt had enforced as New York City's chief of police. The impact of the bullet knocked the ex-president turned candidate down. Then he jumped back up, spat into his hand to see if blood would come out, indicating that his lung had been pierced. Amazingly, the bullet had passed through Roosevelt's folded-up speech, as well as his metal eyeglass case that were in his inner breast pocket. The bullet just hit a rib. Despite the outcry of his supporters, Roosevelt stood at the podium and gave his whole speech while blood slowly soaked out of his white shirt. He said, "I came to give a speech, and I'm going to give a speech." Even when this man gets shot in the chest, he knew how to seize a political opportunity. So On the Democratic side, the Democrats were no more united than Republicans were in 1912. William Jennings Bryan, William Randolph Hearst, and Woodrow Wilson all vied for the Democratic nomination, Wilson winning on the 46th ballot at the convention. Wilson's New Freedom platform condemned Republican centralization of power, called for a lower tariff, pledged to break all trust, and promised to destroy all privilege in government. Wilson viewed himself as the educator of the nation that would teach America what government should be. He said the United States should no longer be ruled by big government and big business. And so Wilson wanted to tackle with his New Freedom what he called the triple wall of privilege: trust, tariffs, and banking. And we'll get more into Wilson's administration here in a little bit. The election results clearly revealed the Republicans' self-destruction. Wilson only received 41% of the vote, a little more than Lincoln did back in 1860. Roosevelt garnered 27%, and Taft won 23%. The Republicans split in the vote, gave 435 electoral votes to Wilson, 88 to Roosevelt, and only 8 to Taft. Interestingly enough, the Socialist Party candidate, Eugene Debs, actually received 6% of the popular vote. Since socialism is even a more extreme form of progressivism, it can be said that 74% of Americans voted for a progressive candidate in the election of 1912, which marks its true significance. It's going to be even more significant when you compare it to the 1920 election results, in which about the same percentage of American voters will vote for a turn away from progressivism. In just 8 short years, the entire mood and temperament of the country is going to completely switch. Wilson's going to win the presidency in 1912, but the real victory was progressivism. Progressivism achieved a revolution in American politics that has continued with minor setbacks until our own day. So this turn of events is the reason why laissez-faire government seems so alien to us. We've never known one. Progressives came from both political parties and consolidated control over American political and economic life. One cannot say social changes were revolutionized, though. Wilson was foremost a Southern gentleman, and blacks did not figure into the political equation he was trying to teach America to solve. He viewed the first feature-length motion picture of America, or In America, The Birth of a Nation. The movie dramatized and romanticized the rise of the KKK, and Wilson pronounced it a fine film. He said it was like a lightning bolt, of a film. And so, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but especially during the Wilson administration, and Roosevelt is to blame too, the plight of the blacks was one of the only problems that this progressive crusade failed to solve.